sanding and painting his boat. Despite his love for the boat, he was extremely inexperienced when it came to actually sailing. He'd spent some time in the intercoastal waterways, but even there, he was just learning the ropes. In late January, Lewis decided he was ready to go on his first trip out into the open water. Even for an experienced sailor, it would have been a dangerous endeavor. Weather conditions also weren't optimal for Lewis. He said it looked like the weather would be good, but forecasts predicted some heavy storms. Lewis set out on January 23rd, heading for Cape Hatteras. 6 days later, his parents contacted authorities. They hadn't heard from him for a week, and even though he had told them about his plan, they were worried that he hadn't checked in with them. Another week passed, and Lewis was confirmed as missing. The U.S. Coast Guard set out to try to find the missing person, and sailors were alerted from New Jersey to Miami. There were a few reported sightings of Lewis, but none could be confirmed. He also hadn't told anybody where he was planning to go, so the search area was too large for an effective search. After 10 days, the search was called off. Lewis's parents claimed they never gave up hope that he would survive. But as weeks turned into months, it looked more and more likely like he was no longer alive. 66 days after Lewis went missing, his family got the call they had been hoping for. A German cargo vessel had spotted a man standing on a small sailboat about 200 miles off the coast of North Carolina. It was Lewis. Early on his trip, his boat capsized while he was sleeping. The mast broke, and Lewis suffered from a broken collarbone. The boat managed to right itself, but the communications equipment had broken, and Lewis had no way of controlling the ship. He explained that he survived by using his clothing to fish and collecting rainwater. He spent as much time as possible in the cabin to avoid sunburn, but had managed to attract the attention of the German ship. Lewis was brought aboard the cargo vessel before being airlifted to the hospital. Miraculously, he was in good condition and was able to walk out not long after, as one of the luckiest men to get lost at sea. Number 4. After over a year of not knowing, the family and friends of Noleg O'Connor finally solved the mystery of what happened to her in one of the most unexpected of ways. Noleg had last been in contact with her family in May of 2013, telling them that she was going traveling. She was last seen in Cornwall, England. The search for Noleg would take her family across Europe until she was finally found by a family friend on vacation. Noleg was a 37-year-old woman from Northern Ireland. She was one of 8 siblings and was described as deeply religious. She was also a keen musician, able to play a variety of instruments as well as sing. Shortly before she vanished, she was diagnosed with some mental health problems, but that didn't appear to be getting in the way of her living her life. She was living in Aberdeen, Scotland at the time of her disappearance, but said she was going to go traveling. At first, Noleg's family didn't realize she hadn't been in contact with any of them. Her siblings all assumed at least one of them had been able to keep in touch with her. But when Christmas came and nobody received any messages from her, they knew something was wrong. Police were able to trace Noleg to Cornwall in the south of England. At the end of May, she was caught on CCTV taking money from an ATM and doing some grocery shopping. After that, she vanished without a trace. Noleg's family started a social media campaign to try to find their missing loved one. Her missing person case was featured on TV and radio news, and sightings were called in from across the UK and Europe. It seemed as if she had managed to get to the continent, but had then run into trouble there. She was considered vulnerable, and her family worried that they might never see her alive. The summer of 2014 came, and there was still no sign of Noleg. The anniversary of the family's last contact with Noleg came and went, but at the start of July, they finally got a breakthrough. Nicholas Cassidy was an old friend of Noleg's who'd been in the scout band with her when they were children. Like all of those who knew Noleg, he'd been trying to help as best he could. At the start of July, he and his wife traveled to Murcia, Spain, for a vacation. It was there that they spotted a woman sleeping under a tree. It was Noleg. It took some convincing, but Nicholas and his wife were able to convince Noleg to come back where they were staying and tell her story. She had been traveling around Europe and busking with her violin before it was stolen in Rome. Since then, she'd lost her passport, papers, and access to her bank account. She'd been begging for food. Noleg was brought home to Northern Ireland and reunited with her relieved family, who asked for prayers to help Noleg's recovery. Number 3. The family of Deepak Kandi had already given him a funeral when police realized they hadn't solved his missing person case. Another 8 months would pass before the truth in this strange case was revealed. Deepak disappeared from his home in India in early June of 2022. Few details have been released on the case, such as the last sightings or any possible motivations for his disappearance. He was in his mid-30s at the time, but it was a concerning change for his family. He was reported missing not long after his disappearance, and the search began. On July 17th, a body was discovered on a beach. It matched the general description given of Deepak, and the body was given to the Kandi family. It was not the end to the mystery they would have been hoping for, but it was an answer to the question and a chance to give their loved one a proper funeral. It was only after this funeral that the police realized Deepak wasn't the only missing person from the area that matched the description of the body found on the beach. A DNA test was conducted and confirmed the body belonged to a man named Irshad. The search for Deepak resumed. For some reason, the crime unit became involved in the search, though it isn't clear if they thought Deepak was the victim of a crime or if he had perpetrated one. There was still no sign of the missing man, though, and the case went cold. It wasn't until February of 2023 that the police received the break they needed. Police were conducting routine checks at hotels. A random check of one particular hotel uncovered a man who used Deepak's identification number. The man was later confirmed as being Deepak himself. He was surprised to learn that his family had conducted his funeral and explained that he'd been traveling around the country before recently settling down. The reason behind his disappearance, though, still hasn't been revealed. Number 2. Percy Pukachiche was missing for more than a month before he was rescued in August of 2022. The 26-year-old had survived on a diet of berries and rabbits while lost in the forest. Percy is a young man from northern Quebec. He was very close to his family and community. But there were still some problems in the area, like many towns and cities, according to Chief Adrian Giroux. It wasn't unusual for some people to go out into the bush to live for periods of time to get away from those issues. Percy was doing just that when he left on July 21st. He wasn't far from the community, and he had done it in the past, with his mother stopping by to bring him some food. When she arrived the next day, Percy's campsite was empty. His provisions had been untouched. The next day, there was still no sign of Percy, and he was reported missing. Thankfully, the case was taken seriously by the local authorities. The police also had a reason to fear for Percy's safety. 3 Anishinaabe communities came together to try to find Percy, with volunteers coming from neighboring towns to take part in search efforts in the wilderness. The search focused on the wooded areas on the shore of the lake, closest to where Percy had vanished. Council employees were given paid time off to take part in the search, and food, water, and gas were offered to all of those who were trying to help solve the mystery. Despite the massive search effort, Percy's disappearance didn't gather much attention in the local media, though posts were put out by the local police with information about Percy's last known location and clothing. But it would turn out that all the search efforts had been focused in the wrong location. On the night of August 23rd, teenagers fishing on the far side of the lake heard cries for help. They immediately contacted authorities, who arrived just 15 minutes later. They called out to the person, asking for him to identify himself. He told them he was Percy Pukachiche. How and why Percy had ended up on the other side of the lake was a mystery. His feet were very sore, but he didn't have any other wounds. He had lost significant weight after a month of living off the land, but the survival techniques that he'd been taught at school had come in useful. Percy was taken to the hospital, but he was released the following day. Number 1. For years, the family and friends of Fernando Cuevas believed that they would never see him again. An appeal by hospital workers in a neighboring country finally answered the mystery of what had happened to the missing man. In 2011, Fernando left his home in Uruguay on a spontaneous trip. It wasn't unusual for the then 36-year-old. Fernando had spent much of his adult life traveling around South America. According to his family, he was extremely studious and hardworking at school, but began to use illegal substances as he got older, and things had spiraled out of control. At one point, he was imprisoned in Brazil for attacking another person, and he'd given up on treatment for his problems with illegal substances. It wasn't unusual for him to disappear for weeks at a time, but when they hadn't heard from him for several weeks, Fernando's friends and family began to fear the worst. More than 3 years passed, and Fernando's family went through the process of having him declared as having passed away. But in 2014, one of Fernando's family members came across a viral post from Argentina. The Facebook post was made by workers at a hospital in the city of Corrientes. For years, they'd been caring for a man who'd forgotten who he was, and now they were hoping they could find his family. The man had been given the name Wilson Perez. In 2011, Wilson had been found on the street, unconscious and with significant wounds. He had been violently attacked. He was wearing women's clothing and had no ID with him. But he did have a piece of paper with the name Wilson Perez. He was rushed to the hospital where workers believed he might not survive. He was baptized as Wilson Perez and read his last rites. Miraculously, Wilson survived and began the long road to recovery from his traumatic ordeal. But the wounds to his head meant that he could never live independently. It also meant he'd forgotten who he was before he arrived at the hospital. He was very friendly and made friends with the nurses at the hospital, who decided to try to solve the mystery of who Wilson Perez really was by setting up a Facebook page for him. As soon as Fernando's parents saw the photo of Wilson, they knew it was their son. They flew to Argentina and reunited with the